The first thing my neighbor ever said to me wasn't, "Welcome to the neighborhood," or "Need a hand with those boxes." No. This guy leaned against his porch railing with a beer in one hand, looked me dead in the eye while I unloaded my truck, and laughed like he had just watched somebody walk straight into a bear trap. Then he turned to his wife, loud enough for me to hear every word, and said, "Great. Another idiot who bought property without checking the survey lines." And man, the way he said it, smug, relaxed, almost excited, like he already knew something I didn't, that told me everything I needed to know about him before we even officially met. His name was Rick Halpern, retired insurance adjuster, self-appointed king of Maple Ridge Court, the kind of guy who trimmed his lawn with military precision, but somehow still had enough free time to monitor everybody else's business from behind polarized Oakleys. I'd only been there maybe 40 minutes, still sweaty from driving across 2 states, and this man had already decided I was the next victim in whatever little land grab game he'd been running for years. The funny thing is, I didn't react. I didn't snap back, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge the comment. That seemed to disappoint him a little. Guys like Rick feed off reactions. Silence makes them nervous. So I just kept unloading my boxes while he stood there grinning like a coyote watching a rabbit wander into a fence line. Now here's the part that matters. Rick's backyard looked bigger than everybody else's. Not by a little either. His cedar fence stretched several feet farther than the neighboring lots, and once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. He had this polished stone patio, built-in fire pit, raised garden beds, expensive landscaping lights, all tucked neatly behind that fence like some magazine spread called Suburban Dad Wins Midlife Crisis. Only problem was, about 4 feet of that backyard wasn't actually his. It belonged to me. I knew it before I even signed closing papers because unlike most buyers, I actually read plats, easements, setback documents, all of it. Occupational hazard, I guess. But I didn't say anything immediately because I wanted to see what kind of man Rick really was. Turns out he volunteered the answer all on his own. About a week after I moved in, he wandered over while I was checking the side yard drainage after a storm. Didn't introduce himself normally, didn't ask how I liked the house. Nope. First thing out of his mouth was, "Just so we're clear, that fence stays exactly where it is." Not hello, not welcome, a warning. Then he smiled again. That same arrogant little smile people wear when they've gotten away with something for so long they confuse luck with ownership. I looked over at the fence, then back at him, and said, "Interesting." That irritated him immediately because he expected resistance, expected emotion. Calm people scare bullies because calm means confidence. So he doubled down. "Previous owners never had a problem with it," he said. "HOA already knows about it too." And there it was, the magic word. HOA. Some people hear those 3 letters and instantly fold. Rick knew that. Guys like him weaponize procedure because they assume nobody else understands it. He thought I was some quiet middle-aged guy with moving boxes and a pickup truck, somebody too tired to fight. What he didn't realize was I'd spent 30 years dealing with land development disputes, zoning hearings, easement litigation, county engineering reviews, all the ugly little behind-the-scenes battles homeowners never see. But again, I stayed quiet. I just nodded slowly like I was considering his warning seriously. That seemed to relax him. He probably walked back inside feeling victorious already. The next morning, I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee and actually measured the encroachment myself. For feet, 2 inches at the deepest point. Not accidental. Not even close. That fence had been intentionally placed to absorb part of the adjacent parcel. And once I started examining the grading around the patio, I realized something even worse. He'd redirected runoff drainage onto the neighboring property years earlier to protect his landscaping, which meant this wasn't just a fence issue anymore. This was liability territory, structural liability, county violation territory. Suddenly his little smirk made a lot more sense. Rick wasn't confident because he was right. He was confident because nobody before me understood what they were looking at. That afternoon, while Rick was out front washing his SUV like he was starring in a commercial nobody asked for, I made one phone call. Just one. And by Friday morning, 3 county survey trucks rolled slowly into Maple Ridge Court like the opening scene of a disaster movie. The look on Rick's face when he saw those orange vests stepping onto his backyard. Man, that alone was almost worth the moving expenses. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of homeowners completely misunderstand how these situations work And honestly, guys like Rick count on that confusion. See, people assume if a fence has been sitting somewhere long enough, that automatically makes it legal. It doesn't. According to standard procedure, property boundaries are established by recorded surveys, subdivision plats, deed descriptions, and county filings, not by confidence, not by landscaping, and definitely not by whoever yells the loudest during HOA meetings. And HOAs? They scare people way more than they should. Most HOA boards aren't out there verifying every fence location with forensic precision. They approve aesthetics, materials, height restrictions, stuff like that. If someone submits paperwork claiming the fence sits within their lot line, the board often takes that at face value unless another homeowner challenges it. From a legal perspective, an HOA approval doesn't magically override county land records. That's where people get trapped. And psychologically, this is actually pretty fascinating. This is a psychological trap called assumed authority. Somebody acts confident long enough, speaks aggressively enough, maybe throws around a few legal-sounding phrases, and eventually everybody around them stops questioning whether they're actually correct. Rick had probably spent years bullying softer personalities into silence, so by the time I arrived, he genuinely believed the fence belonged there because nobody had ever successfully challenged him. That kind of unchecked behavior becomes part ego, part habit, part delusion. The lesson here is, the loudest person in the neighborhood usually isn't the most informed one. They're just the most practiced at intimidating people who don't know the rules. And unfortunately for Rick, I knew the rules better than he did. Friday morning hit quiet and gray, one of those heavy overcast mornings where the whole neighborhood feels half asleep, and I remember standing in my kitchen watching through the blinds while the first county truck rolled slowly down Maple Ridge Court. You ever notice how official vehicles move differently than normal traffic? Slow, deliberate, like they already know nobody's going to stop them. Behind that first truck came two more, then a utility trailer carrying survey equipment that probably cost more than Rick's entire backyard renovation. Bright orange tripods, GPS units, transit scanners. The real stuff, not some guy with a tape measure and a clipboard. And the second those trucks parked near my driveway, curtains started twitching all over the street. Because suburban neighborhoods run on two things, lawn fertilizer and gossip. Rick came outside maybe 30 seconds later wearing gym shorts, white tube socks pulled halfway to his knees, coffee mug still in his hand, trying to act casual even though you could already see tension creeping into his face. He walked halfway across his lawn and called out, "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" That fake friendly tone people use when they're seconds away from losing control. The lead surveyor barely looked up. "County verification order," he said, calm as could be. "Boundary reassessment and drainage compliance review." And man, the way Rick's face tightened when he heard the word drainage. That was the moment I knew he understood exactly how bad this could get. He looked over at me standing near my garage, probably expecting some kind of grin or smart remark, but I didn't give him one. Honestly, I think that bothered him more. Calmness feels dangerous when you're guilty. The crew got to work immediately, setting control points, checking markers, scanning elevations. No drama, no arguing, just cold precision. And that's the thing about real professionals. They don't need to raise their voices because measurements don't care about feelings. Rick hovered nearby for almost 20 minutes pretending to do yard work while secretly listening to every word. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He walked over toward the lead surveyor and said, "There's been a fence there for years. HOA approved it already." The surveyor nodded politely without even pausing his work. "HOA jurisdiction doesn't supersede county plat records, sir." Short, direct, fatal. You could practically hear Rick's blood pressure spike from across the yard. Then came the moment that changed the entire atmosphere. One of the younger survey techs pulled an old subdivision file from the truck, flipped through a stack of laminated plats, and frowned for a second. "Hold on," he said, looking toward me. "Your name's Nolan Mercer, right?" I nodded once. The guy looked back down at the document, then immediately straightened his posture. "You're the engineer who signed the original grading and drainage approvals for Maple Ridge Phase 2? Now, let me tell you something about human beings. There are moments where somebody realizes they completely misunderstood who they were dealing with, and you can literally watch the recalculation happen behind their eyes. Rick had spent 2 weeks treating me like some clueless homeowner who got lucky buying property. Suddenly, he was staring at the guy who helped design the infrastructure underneath his entire street. The coffee mug lowered slowly out of his hand. The smirk disappeared, and for the first time since I moved in, Rick looked uncertain. The lead surveyor glanced between us, then back at the plat, and gave this little half-laugh. While that certainly explains why the complaint package was so detailed. Complaint package, not complaint. Package. Because once I realized the drainage had been altered, I documented everything. Elevation shifts, runoff patterns, fence encroachment, retaining edge pressure near the patio foundation, photos after rainfall, timestamp measurements. See, people think these disputes get resolved through emotional arguments between neighbors. They don't. They get resolved through documentation. Rick still tried to salvage it. Of course he did. Guys like that never surrender cleanly. He started talking faster now, voice tightening with every sentence. Look, previous owners never cared. We've maintained this property for years. Everybody knows this yard's been like this forever. Translation? Please let me keep what I stole because I've gotten emotionally attached to it. But according to county records, emotional attachment doesn't move legal boundaries. The survey crew spent nearly 4 hours verifying every marker line in the subdivision. And every single measurement landed exactly where I already knew it would. For feet, 2 inches of encroachment at the deepest section. Drainage violations extending beyond approved grading slope. Unpermitted hardscape additions inside setback limitations. It was bad. Worse than bad, honestly, because once counties discover one violation, they start looking for others. And suddenly Rick's beautiful backyard paradise started transforming into a liability report. Around lunchtime, another county vehicle arrived. Code enforcement this time. That's when panic really set in. Rick's wife came outside asking what was happening, and you could tell immediately she hadn't known the full story either. She kept looking back and forth between the officials and her husband like she was trying to solve a math equation that suddenly stopped making sense. Rick pulled her aside at one point and whispered aggressively for almost a full minute. She crossed her arms afterward and walked straight back inside without another word. That silence, honestly louder than screaming. By late afternoon, orange marker flags cut directly across Rick's patio like surgical lines before an amputation. Right through the fire pit area too. The survey supervisor finally approached us holding a folder thick with paperwork and said, "Mr. Halpern, you'll be receiving a formal restoration order from the county." Nobody spoke for a second. You ever witness somebody realizing consequences are finally real? It's strange. The ego leaves first. Then the anger. Then comes this hollow disbelief, like their brain keeps searching for an escape hatch that doesn't exist anymore. Rick tried one last swing anyway. "So what? You're seriously making me tear all this out over a few feet?" The supervisor looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, sir. You created unauthorized improvements on land you do not own while altering protected drainage flow. The footage is actually the smallest issue here." Oof, that one landed hard. From that point on, the neighborhood dynamic changed completely. People who used to nod at Rick from their driveways suddenly avoided eye contact. Funny how quickly authority disappears once the illusion cracks. Over the next few weeks, the dismantling began. First, the cedar fence came down panel by panel. Then contractors jackhammered sections of the flagstone patio apart. The built-in fire pit got demolished next. Even the raised garden beds had to go because they sat partially inside the easement correction zone. Every day after work, I'd see another piece missing. Another layer peeled away. And the whole time, I never said a word to him. Didn't need to. Reality had already handled the conversation for me. The county gave Rick 30 days to restore the affected property and submit compliant drainage corrections signed by a licensed engineer, which, considering the irony, almost made me laugh out loud. For a while, the neighborhood got very quiet whenever I walked outside. Not hostile quiet. Respectful quiet. People started waving differently, asking questions differently. Because once folks realized what had actually happened, the story spread fast. That new guy? Yeah. Turns out he practically designed half the subdivision. But the truth is, the engineering part wasn't even the important lesson. The important lesson was restraint. Most people think power looks loud. They think strength means yelling harder than the other guy. But real leverage? Real leverage is understanding systems, so while you never have to raise your voice at all. About 2 months later, I saw Rick one final time while checking my mailbox. He looked older somehow. Smaller. He avoided eye contact at first, then finally muttered, "Guess you knew what you were talking about." I almost laughed at that because no, this was never about talking. That was his mistake from the very beginning. Rick thought the loudest man controlled the situation. But measurements don't care who talks the most. County records don't care who's lived there longer. And survey lines, well, survey lines definitely don't care about ego. You know, after everything settled down and the truck stopped showing up and the neighborhood found its next piece of gossip to chew on, I kept thinking about how weirdly common these situations really are. Not necessarily the giant illegal patio part. Although trust me, that happens more than people realize, but the psychology behind it. Because Rick was never really fighting over 4 feet of land. He was fighting over identity, control, reputation. Guys like him build these little kingdoms around themselves over time, and eventually they stop separating what's legally theirs from what they've simply gotten comfortable taking. And once that happens, anybody questioning them feels like a personal attack instead of a factual correction. That's why he laughed at me the first day. The laugh wasn't confidence, it was conditioning. He expected another quiet homeowner who would see conflict coming and immediately back down. He'd probably spent years training the people around him to avoid confrontation because, honestly, most folks don't want tension with neighbors. They want peace, predictability, easy barbecues, and clean driveways. Rick understood that, and he weaponized it. But here's the dangerous part. When nobody pushes back against small abuses of power, those abuses grow. Slowly, quietly, until one day somebody's backyard is 4 feet wider than it's supposed to be, and they've convinced themselves it was always theirs. From a legal perspective, this story could have gone much uglier if I hadn't documented everything carefully and handled it through proper county channels. That matters a lot, because emotional revenge creates messy outcomes, but procedural accountability creates permanent ones. According to standard procedure, the strongest position in any property dispute is almost always the calmest and best documented one. Not the loudest, not the angriest, the most prepared. And honestly, that applies to life way beyond fences and HOAs. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into, assuming confidence equals competence. It doesn't. Some people are just very practiced at sounding certain while standing on weak foundations. The lesson here is, patience can look weak right up until the moment consequences arrive. Then suddenly everybody understands who actually had control the whole time. And if I'm being honest, the strangest part wasn't watching the fence come down. It was watching how quickly the neighborhood recalibrated afterward. People who once treated Rick like the unofficial mayor of the block suddenly acted careful around him, because authority built on intimidation disappears fast once reality checks in. Me personally, I never hated the guy. I think that surprises people. I just understood something he didn't. Ownership isn't about what you can hold on to temporarily. It's about what actually belongs to you when the paperwork gets pulled out and the measurements start. So now I'm curious, what would you have done in my position? Would you have confronted Rick immediately the first day he opened his mouth? Would you have ignored the whole thing to avoid drama with the neighbors? Or would you have handled it the same way I did, quietly, patiently, and with receipts? Let me know in the comments because trust me, HOA stories always bring out the wildest opinions on the internet.